The night you're about to step into is not a night easily forgotten, for it bears the weight of a truth whispered only in the hidden corridors of time, a truth that once revealed changes the listener forever. Welcome back to the Unveiled Scroll, my fellow wanderers of the unseen. Before we descend further into this dim corridor of what might have been, remember to like, subscribe, and share, for the shadows hold many tales, and only with your torch beside mine can we continue to unveil them. Tonight, we journey into a manuscript long buried beneath centuries of dust, a chronicle whose very existence was denied by those sworn to guard the boundaries of history. Its name is the Forbidden Chronicle that unveils a cataclysm buried in shadows, and the chapter you are about to hear, whispered across generations, speaks of a calamity so profound that even the scribes tasked with recording it could scarcely bring their quills to the parchment. Legend holds that in the late years of a forgotten empire, an archivist named Lucian Olderveld discovered a sealed coffer hidden deep within the northern wing of the imperial repository. Lucian was a man shaped by silence, reserved in his speech, precise in his habits, and wholly devoted to the order that governed the preservation of knowledge. His colleagues often described him as a lantern kept behind glass, glowing but never warming the room. Yet beneath his quiet demeanor, Lucian harbored an unease that lingered like the aftertaste of a bitter herb. For years he had sensed discrepancies, dates that contradicted themselves. Records meticulously altered, entire events reduced to a single ambiguous line. It was during a storm that rattled the tiles of the capital that Lucian first noticed the loose stone beneath the northern shelves. The coffer he uncovered was bound with iron hinges etched in a script he had encountered only once before, a language spoken by those who chronicled the Empire's darkest hours. The key was missing, but Lucian, driven by curiosity that bordered on compulsion, pried it open, snapping the ancient lock with shaking hands. Inside lay a single scroll, sealed with crimson wax. The sigil impressed upon it was unmistakable, the mark of the eclipse, reserved only for accounts deemed too dangerous to be read by the living. Lucian hesitated. Opening such a document was an act punishable by exile, sometimes worse. Yet something in the air pressed him forward, as though the shadows themselves leaned closer. He broke the seal. What he found within would fracture the fragile veneer of order the Empire had woven for centuries. The scroll described a night called the Veiled Sundering, an event erased from official annals. An event said to have reshaped the destiny of the Empire in ways no scholar was permitted to know. It spoke of an omen that appeared above the citadel in an immense halo of pale light, silent, trembling, widening until it resembled a suspended luminous wound in the sky. Witnesses claimed the light revealed silhouettes moving within, figures tall and indistinct, gliding as if waiting. The scroll was not merely a record. It was a confession penned by someone who had witnessed the calamity firsthand. As Lucian read, he realized the writer was not merely documenting events, but begging anyone who found the truth to flee, to abandon the Empire before the pattern repeated. Yet as he continued, a detail gnawed at him. The handwriting. It felt familiar, intimately so. He compared it to the signatures of former archivists, then to the script of lost scholars. But the resemblance was too precise, too unsettling. It mirrored his own handwriting. Lucian recoiled in disbelief, the scroll trembling in his hands. The ink, though centuries old, curved with the same learned steadiness he had developed over decades. This was impossible, or perhaps, he feared, impossibility was merely a veil the Empire used to keep its citizens compliant. With each line he read, the sense of inevitability deepened, as though time itself looped around him like a tightening snare. The scroll spoke of a solitary archivist, unnamed, who uncovered forbidden truths and unwittingly triggered the return of the omen. Lucian felt the weight of eyes upon him, though the repository remained silent. His breath grew shallow. The storm outside intensified, its thunder rattling the shelves. At that moment, Lucian understood that whatever had happened during the Veiled Sundering had never truly ended. It had only been waiting. Lucian steadied himself as the lantern beside him flickered with a tremor not caused by the storm. The air thickened, as though the ancient dust inhaled with him, sharing his breath, waiting for his next move. He forced his gaze back onto the scroll, compelled not by curiosity now, but by a strange, spine-deep recognition, as though every word had been shaped by a memory he had forgotten yet mourned. The next portion of the Chronicle described how the omen, the luminous wound in the heavens, had spread its influence across the empire. It did not descend with thunder or flame. Instead, it crept silently into the minds of those who saw it. Officials found themselves unable to sleep. Artisans awoke with their hands trembling, and the imperial guards who patrolled the walls reported faint whispers emanating from the very stones beneath their boots. The Chronicle's author described a sensation of watching oneself from afar. A stug one as soul lagged behind the body. Lucian read this with an involuntary shiver, for he had felt a similar sensation ever since opening the coffer. The chronicler continued, recounting how the emperor at the time had summoned the Circle of Scribes, an elite order entrusted with shaping the official histories. Their duty was not merely to record events, but to decide which truths were tolerable, which should be softened, and which must be erased entirely. The emperor demanded they seal all knowledge of the omen. Yet before they could act, something peculiar occurred within their chamber. The scribes, sworn to secrecy and stability, began writing uncontrollably, as if possessed. Lines poured onto parchment with frantic speed, describing the omen in excruciating detail. When the frenzy ended, every scribe had written the same exact passage, word for word, in identical script. Lucian froze. He knew the imperial records mentioned nothing of this incident. It had been buried, but the chronicler had preserved it, knowing one day someone would need to understand. The scroll then described the night. The veiled sundering truly began. The sky darkened abruptly, as though the sun were consumed by an unseen veil. Yet the moon, instead of dimming, brightened with unnatural clarity, illuminating the citadel with a cold, silver radiance. Citizens who gazed upon it felt an overwhelming pressure in their chests, as though the air had thickened into something almost liquid. The chronicler wrote that the figures seen within the bright halo began to descend, not physically, but as silhouettes sinking into reflections, slipping into pools of shadow cast by torchlight. Lantern flames warped, twisting into elongated shapes that whispered in languages no living voice had uttered for centuries. By this point in the account, Lucian's hands were trembling. The ink seemed to pulse faintly, as though reacting to his quickening breath. His heart pounded against his ribs like a prisoner, testing the strength of his cage. The scroll spoke of the chronicler attempting to warn the people, but discovering that those touched by the omen no longer heard his voice. Their eyes had dulled, as though the silhouettes reflected within them had replaced whatever spark once defined their humanity. Only a few remained untouched, and they fled the capital before the phenomenon reached its crescendo. Yet the chronicler stayed, convinced his duty was to witness, to preserve, to ensure someday someone might understand. Lucian could feel a heaviness spreading through his own limbs, a slow numbness creeping across his shoulders, as though the air around him thickened, just as the chronicler described. He struggled to steady his breath. The repository seemed colder than before, shadows pooling unnaturally between the shelves. As he read further, the chronicler revealed the moment the halo ruptured. A soundless burst of light cascaded through the capital, freezing everything it touched, not in ice, but in stillness. Birds suspended mid-flight, leaves locked in the moment of their fall. People captured in expressions halfway between terror and awe. The entire city had become a painting, flawless, untouchable, motionless, all except for the chronicler, who described feeling an invisible force pulling him toward the citadel, guiding him to the very repository where Lucian now stood centuries later. Lucian stopped breathing for a moment. The chronicler described a hidden chamber beneath the northern shelves, sealed behind a stone engraved with the mark of the eclipse. There, he had placed the coffer containing the scroll. But the final lines of this section chilled Lucian to his core. The chronicler wrote that he could sense someone in the future reading his words, someone whose presence resonated with his own. He described this future reader with unsettling specificity. A reserved archivist, quiet, diligent, shaped by silence, haunted by discrepancies in the records, and unknowingly tied to the omen's return. The chronicler ended this section with a final, haunting message addressed not to the Empire, but to the one who would open the coffer. Lucian Aldervel, you were always meant to find this. For the first time that night, he realized he was not merely uncovering history. He was fulfilling it. Lucien stood motionless, the scroll clasped tightly in his shaking hands, as though letting go would allow the words to seep into the stone floor and echo back at him in a voice not his own. The storm outside had calmed, yet the silence that replaced it felt far more oppressive, heavy with the weight of unspoken revelations. His lantern dimmed, its flame bowing inward as though recoiling. Something in the air shifted, subtle yet unmistakable, like a breath drawn from the walls themselves. Lucien forced himself to reopen the scroll. There was one final section, sealed beneath a faint residue of wax that cracked like brittle bone beneath his thumb. The last passage was shorter than the rest, but its brevity only sharpened the dread coiling within him. The chronicler wrote of returning to the citadel as highest chamber the moment after sealing the scroll away. From there he beheld the frozen city below, a landscape suspended in a single, eternal heartbeat. But the chronicler claimed he saw something else reflected in the luminous wound still hovering in the heavens. It was not merely an omen, it was a mirror. The figures within the halo shifted, and from their movements the chronicler discerned a pattern, a looping cadence, as though time itself were being rewritten through their motions. The chronicler understood then that the veiled sundering was not a singular calamity, but a cycle repeating through ages each time. Drawn to an archivist of a particular temperament, a guardian of truth, compelled by a force deeper than curiosity. The chronicler wrote that the only way to halt the cycle was to confront the reflection at its source, to step into the haleless light and let it judge whether the seeker was worthy to break the pattern or be consumed by it. Lucien felt the pulse of the lantern match his heartbeat, both wavering with growing instability. His breath tightened again, but this time he felt a presence behind him, not physical but undeniably close, like the lingering warmth of someone who had just spoken near his ear. He turned. Nothing. But the shadows stretched in ways they had not before, bending inward, their edges rippling softly as though acknowledging him. He returned his gaze to the scroll, only to find new ink forming on the parchment, as though written in real time by an invisible hand. The words unfurled slowly. The cycle begins again. You stand where I once stood. If you do nothing, the stillness will return. If you seek the source, the truth will claim you as it claimed me. You cannot remain between fates. Choose. The ink glistened as though wet. Lucien's mind raced. The repository suddenly felt unbearably small, its towering shelves leaning subtly inward, a cathedral of knowledge silently urging him toward a decision. His breath fogged in the cold air. Some instinct older than fear guided his steps as he moved deeper into the northern wing. He reached the stone wall, described in the Chronicle, the one bearing the mark of the eclipse. At first, he saw nothing unusual, but when he raised the lantern, the sigil shimmered faintly, as if waking from centuries of slumber. Lucien pressed his hand against the stone. It yielded with a soft, shuddering groan, opening to reveal a narrow stair descending into darkness. The air within smelled of age and iron, as though the weight of time itself seeped through its walls. He descended, each step colder than the last, each echo merging with a second, softer footfall that did not belong to him. When he reached the chamber at the bottom, he found it empty, except for a circular pool of still water at its center. The surface reflected not the lantern's glow, nor Lucien's own face, but the sky above the citadel on the night of the veiled sundering. The luminous wound hovered within the reflection, swirling silently. Lucien felt an irresistible pull, as though the reflection were reaching outward, beckoning him to step forward. He knelt at its edge, his breath trembling. Within the reflection, he saw figures moving, their silhouettes clearer now, shaped almost like people yet stretched, elongated, their gestures rhythmic. Weaving patterns like calligraphy danced through light. Then the reflection shifted. He saw the frozen city. He saw the chronicler's hand reaching. And then he saw himself, but the version reflected in the water was not the man kneeling at its edge. It was the chronicler, or rather, a fusion of the chronicler and Lucien, their features blending as though time had folded them together. His reflection spoke without sound. The pattern binds those who seek to break it. Lucien felt tears form unbidden, All his life he had preserved history, believing truth was a light that freed the world from darkness. But now he saw that some truths did not liberate. They ends not it. The luminous wound within the reflection trembled, widening once more. Just as the Chronicle had described, the light reached upward, stretching out of the water's surface toward him. Lucian felt its warmth, gentle yet overwhelming, like a memory returning with unbearable clarity. He understood then, the cycle was not simply repeating. It was choosing, and it had chosen him. The light enveloped him. His hands loosened, the scroll falling silently to the chamber floor. The warmth deepened, growing brighter, filling him with a sensation both terrifying and strangely serene. He felt himself dissolve, not dying, but merging, becoming part of the pattern that had haunted the Empire for centuries. The chamber's walls faded. The pool of water stretched into a horizon. The luminous wound expanded until it consumed everything. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light blinked out. The repository above fell silent. The lantern by the coffer extinguished. Centuries later, scholars would search for records of Lucian Aldervale, only to find gaps where his name should have been, as though he had been gently erased from time, leaving only faint echoes in the margins of forgotten tomes. And yet, on certain nights when storms gather above the old citadel, archivists claim the northern shelves flicker with silver light. Some insist they hear the scratching of a quill writing from behind the stone. Others swear they see a silhouette drifting between the stacks, searching, always searching. And those who dare whisper the tale of the forbidden chronicle recall the final words etched into the bottom of the scroll, the only line that never fades no matter how often the parchment is scrubbed. The pattern continues, awaiting the next seeker. And so, wanderer of hidden histories, as we close tonight's unveiling, beware what truths you choose to chase. For some doors, once opened, do not close. Thank you for traveling with me through the shadows on the Unveiled Scroll. If this tale stirred your curiosity, your wonder, or the slightest chill along your spine, remember to like, share, and subscribe, and continue your journey with the other mysteries awaiting on our channel. Until we meet again beneath the veiled horizon, keep your torch lit. The shadows are always listening.